Hello, welcome to this England Netball 2024 Rules of Netball Update Contact and Game Management session. My name's Gary Burgess and I'm the head of officiating here at England Netball, and I'll be taking you through this session. Now, this session should be watched in conjunction with the full Rules of Netball Update webinar. We've provided this additional contact and game management content just to provide extra time to discuss some of these key areas that weren't able to be discussed in the main session. Now, the purpose of this session is to provide the Netball family with a grassroots level update on the 2024 rules, but specifically relating to contact and game management. We'll also provide a recap on effective umpiring techniques and then share a reminder of how to submit rules questions and also to where to find the answers to those submissions. We'll also be able to signpost attendees to the World Netball videos on contact and game management at the end of the session. Now, if you have any issues throughout this session, please do visit England Netball Officiating Rules and Updates. A Google search, just type in England Netball Rules and Updates and it will take you straight there. But there are all the links and all of the videos and all of the registration processes can be found there. Okay. So then, contact. Now, as explained on the webinar, the contact rules have been updated to aid the interpretation and to make the rules easier to apply. Okay, so contact now is not really about the incidental bumps and brushes and that physicality and the bumping around that happens in netball, because netball is, as Jess Thirlby says, it's a highly contested game. It's no longer a non-contact sport. But now contact really is about interference, okay? And the rule itself now explains what interference looks like. There have been other additions within the rule as well that cover causing contact both of a player in the air and a moving player. There's been a clarification around inevitable contact, which makes it a lot clearer. And then there is a really, really strong link in contact endangering player safety and the game management rules. Now, throughout this presentation, you will notice in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a little rulebook icon, and in every page, you'll see the rule number, the rule name, and then also which page it refers to in the rulebook itself. So it's always good whilst you're watching this back to press pause and actually go back and have a look through the rulebook. Okay, so then contact itself. So the rule now says when attacking, defending, or playing the ball, a player must not engage in any physical contact with an opponent that unfairly interferes with the opponent's play, whether or not that was accidental or deliberate. Now, some of the things to look at when you're penalising contact, and these may include, but are not really limited to, things like pushing, tripping, grabbing, holding, or leaning on an opponent. Okay, knocking or hitting an opponent when they're shooting for goal, so placing their hands on the ball or knocking their arm when they're shooting, hitting or placing the hands on the ball held by an opponent, so not necessarily just shooting but through the court as well. And then also, while holding the ball, you can't push it into another opponent. Okay. Now, for those of you that have attended one of our officiating courses recently, you'll see the terminology string just as a reminder there at the bottom. There's a whistle, contact goal shooter, penalty pass blue, and the where ordinarily relates to the direction of play and where it should be taken in line, or the umpire pointing to the specific place on the court. Now, when we're talking about interference, so as I said, all of this incidental rolling and bumping and all of this sort of stuff that goes on in a netball game is now acceptable. It's absolutely acceptable. We've all come to terms with the fact that people will bump into each other, but you are looking for the rule to be broken. It should be a snap, and that snap is interference. So when we're talking about interference, to be penalised as contact, the physical interaction, the physical contact must result in either one, a loss of the ball by an opponent that's in possession. Okay, so they either drop it or the arm hits and the ball goes off in a different direction. Interference with the passing or shooting action of an opponent. Okay, so if you're leaning on the player and they can't get their arm out and you're pinning them, or if they go to pass and you hit their arm and the ball deviates off, that's also covered in that situation. And then also the third part, which makes contact really obvious, okay, is that a change or changes in the body position of an opponent. So you should see a movement. You should see a player being bumped. All of these incidental brushes, and some of us are in a situation where we do have footage of our game, but if you were to press a rewind button, you should clearly see the rule being broken. You should see a reaction. You should see a deviation of a ball. Okay, so where these soft brushes and bumps and slight leans happen, they are all left now, and contact should be a lot obvious and a lot more obvious to see. Okay. So, some additional updates for causing contact. Okay. Now, the rules, as I said earlier on, they've been updated to protect player safety, even more so in the game management area of the rules. But the causing contact rules with regards to a player in the air now say that a player can jump and land in their own space, so up and down, or they can jump from their position into any vacant or empty space on the court. Now, that's really important when we're talking about causing contact, because it does mean that a player who jumps in the air and catches the ball and lands on an opponent, an umpire has to think, did that player occupy that space before the player jumped in the air? Okay, because if they did jump, catch, and land, and that player has always been there, the player that's in the air is going to be penalized for causing contact. Okay. Now, the flip to this is that if that player was going, the one that's catching the ball was going to jump and try and land in an empty space up in the air, and a player then moves into that landing space, that is a whole different ball game. Okay, that is causing contact of a player in the air. However, it is incredibly dangerous. Okay, because a player in the air must have a right to land. Okay, now if a player's occupied the space first before they've taken off, that player didn't need to jump because they knew that that player was going to be there. But if the player jumps and this one moves in, once you're in the air, you can't change your trajectory unless you're Superman. So you're going to land, that player's going to have taken your landing space, and it's very likely to be dangerous. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Now, as it says in the fourth bullet point, when two players jump, okay, so you've got two players and they both jump up in the air and one of them catches the ball, it's very likely that they'll both come down at the same time. Now, if they do, they'll probably have a little bump at the bottom, and you may well not have enough interference for that to be penalised. However, if one catches the ball and one lands, okay, fractionally before, they have to yield the landing space so that person can land safely. Now, yielding the landing space basically means just getting out of the way. Okay. Now, because players both go up to challenge simultaneously a lot of the time, it may well be a situation where they do come up and one lands first and it bumps. And ordinarily, you'll see that situation where the penalised player, the contacting player, holds on to them to try and limit the impact of that contact and try and keep them safe, basically. Now, if that happens, you're just dealing with a normal contact infringement. However, if two players, this one's going to catch the ball, goes up, this one lands first, and this one's coming down, and this one makes the decision to go under the landing space. Again, we're talking about dangerous play on that, because that is a conscious effort to move in and cause danger and likely injury to that individual. Okay, so it just is a little bit of a tidy up on there. Now, in all of these scenarios, specifically with contact, you absolutely have to assess each scenario on its own merits. So we can't give you a long list of this, and this equals this, and this. There are some things we can do, okay? And we'll talk more about that in the game management session, but you have to assess each situation on its merits, okay? And the most important thing about this application of the rule is intent. Did the player mean to do it, okay? Or was it accidental, okay? If it was accidental and there's no danger, you're probably swinging towards a contact. If it was deliberate and there is danger, then it's picked up by the game management rules. Okay. Now, causing contact with moving players. Now, I'm known for silly analogies, but they'll be the things that you remember. I can guarantee this. Now, whenever we're talking about causing contact and moving players, I always like to use a couple of car analogies. So, if you imagine that you're driving along in a car and you're following someone, and the person in front slams their brakes on, and you don't have enough time to stop, and you crash into the back of them, the insurance company are going to blame you. Okay, they are going to make you pay for the damage to the car. Now, in netball, if that's happening, so you've got two players tracking along with each other, and the one at the front deliberately puts on the brakes so fast and so quickly that this one has no opportunity but to bump into them, the problem is with the person at the front that put the brakes on. Okay, so that is causing contact by that player. Okay, because this one didn't have any time to stop or take evasive action to avoid that contact from occurring. Okay, now the other thing with moving players is, and as it said in the interference, a player cannot be moved out of their position. Okay, so you're driving your car again. Here's another car analogy. You see a parking space that's a little bit too small for your car. But what you could do is if you just maneuver in there, you could push that car a little bit back and then you've got your space. Okay, the same can happen in the shooting circles. Okay, now if a goal shooter is underneath the ring of the goalpost, they can't really do much out there. If they're being tight marked by a defender, that goal shooter could push that player off their line gradually, and now they're in a better position to either shoot or to rebound if their goal attack's doing it. Now, make sure you take note. I did go with the shooters first, but defenders can also do the same because they can push another player out of the way to get a better defending position or rebounding position. Now we've looked at the goal circles and we talked about the goal circles in this example. However, it can absolutely happen through the court as well. The stop start, that's likely to happen with mid-court players moving at speed. Again, making space and causing contact in that sense could happen around circle edges or transverse lines as well. Okay, now analogies, goodness me. Inevitable contact. Now, if this term is new to people, it was in the rule book in the 2020 edition. But basically, inevitable contact is about sandwiching a player. Now, what I could do now is I could show you all an image of three players, two on the same team and an opponent in the middle, and the two on the same team are squishing that person in. Snapshot in time, I could show you this picture and say, is that inevitable contact? And we'd all probably say, yeah, absolutely. Okay. However, inevitable contact is not about a snapshot in time. It is about prevention of movement, where that player in the middle, the meat in the sandwich, cannot get out of that sandwich unless they contact. Okay, now that doesn't happen like that. That happens after a short, very short period of time. Now, if I elaborate on that, I'm going to use my head. It's the only way I can do it because I haven't got any props. But if this is a player and this is the player and my head is the third player, they could be moving around. Okay, and every time, if we were to take a snapshot of this, every time we go, we could say it's inevitable contact. But people are moving. Okay, and they're not fixing that player into one place and preventing them from moving. Okay, so what you're looking for when you're penalizing inevitable contact is the point where that player cannot move and you're literally moving. Now, it's not in the direction that they might want to move. If there was a way out, so if two players are holding that player that way and there's a clear way out the back, that's not inevitable contact. Just because they can't go the way they want to go doesn't mean to say it's inevitable contact. It has to be pinned together so the player can't move. And ordinarily, the trigger that you're looking for is a look of innocence from the person in the middle going, I can't move. What am I going to do? Okay, so that just tidies up inevitable contact in that aspect. Okay, now moving on. Contact endangering player safety. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier on, the rules of netball have been updated to promote player safety, to make umpires act, okay, and to respond to instances of danger. Okay, so in this application of the rule, player safety is paramount consideration for all umpires. Okay, now if a player is contacted and it endangers their safety, it links directly to dangerous play, and we will cover that at length. Okay, but just to prepare you for that, a player who pushes, grabs, holds, knocks, or hits the arms, legs, or body of an airborne player. In a manner that puts a safe landing at risk will be deemed to be endangering safety. It is dangerous. Okay. Likewise, as I said earlier on, a player who moves into the landing space of a player that's jumped in the air will be deemed as dangerous. Okay. Again, a player who fails to yield the landing space and causes a player in the air to fall again will be deemed to be dangerous. Now, when we're talking about dangerous play and the umpire says it's dangerous, the only consideration in the 2024 rules is am I going to suspend for am I going to send them off for 2 minutes suspension, or am I going to order them off for 4 minutes? And I'll talk a little bit more about order off changes in a moment. Okay, now the only extra bit in contact endangering player safety is any action either unnecessarily forceful, careless, reckless, or dangerous that affects the safety of another player and results in either a head or neck contact or contact of the head or neck on the post or the ground or the playing enclosure, as it's called in the rule book, will also be deemed dangerous play. Okay, now the one caveat on all of this, and I must be very clear on this does not mean that any bump or slight brush on the head or neck will lead to a player being dangerous. Okay, we play an aerial game. Okay, it's all up here, and players will go and try to intercept situations like this. Okay, now do not assume that everything is dangerous, because you also have still got a warning. Okay, you can still warn a player for intentional contact. It does sound a little bit strange, because whenever I think about intentional contact, I think it sounds a bit like a punch or a double arm push. That's not, that's dangerous play. Okay, but if a player forcefully runs through and they had a choice to slow down, then they're going to be in trouble. Okay, so there's all of those sorts of things to think about, but ultimately the link between contact and game management with this specific aspect of the rule is very, very clear. And both rules really should be read alongside each other. All right, so that's just a general overview on the contact rules. Okay, that nicely takes us into game management. Now, game management has been updated and kind of simplified to encourage the use. Okay, now there is a big change coming, and I'll tell you about that on the next slide. But it is also about players taking responsibility for changing their behavior, following clear instructions from the umpires. Okay, the rulebook tells umpires what they must do. Okay, it's not a choice, it is mandatory. If you cause a player in the air to fall, whether accidental or deliberate, and they hit the deck, the umpire is considering whether or not you're going to be suspended or ordered off. Okay, that's what the rule book says. It's not on the umpire, it's on the situation. Okay. Now, the rules have also been updated to keep players safe. That's the number one reason in here. Okay. It's also to address the high number of penalties. Now, there are so many penalties going on, and seemingly a caution was given historically. And again, there was no behavior change. So teams and players were racking up a huge amount of penalties, and there was no behavior change affected. Okay, now when you come to the end of that racking up of penalties, there are now greater consequences for those individuals that decide, because it's always a decision, to play outside of the rules. Okay, now the one thing I will say about game management at the beginning on page 58, and there are principles in another couple of the other rules, particularly in advantage, there's a set of principles which basically tells you why the rule's written in the way it is, and how it should be applied, okay, or suggestions on how it should be applied and interpreted. Now, the reason those are in there and the reason why this has all been simplified is because, as we know, netball is a global game, and it just removes any of that doubt of inconsistency in interpretation across the world. It is as it is in the rule book for a reason. Okay, now moving on. Now, before we talk about the changes, there's just a few reminders. Now, with the updates to game management, if you've been on an officiating course recently, since the 1st of May, you would have seen this already. But for those of you that have been on courses and qualified over the last couple of years, or people that have qualified a long time ago, the ladder that you can see on the screen, basically, well, it's not basic, it's called the game management ladder. But basically, these are the steps that umpires should follow, one after the other, to try and change umpires' behavior. Now, the most important thing for me, or most important one of these on here, is effective umpiring. Okay. Now, there may be situations when an umpire may have to jump to a step further down. So, as I've said, quite simply throughout all of this, if a player moves into the landing space of an opponent and causes them to fall, you don't worry about effective umpire and proactive advice and escalating and advancing. You've just got to go straight in at step 4, suspension. Okay, the first time it happens. There's no, okay, we'll let you off this time. You jump in straight away at that point. Okay, but while we're here, let's talk about effective umpiring. So, as I've mentioned, the main role of an umpire is to change player behavior. And the best way to do that is to apply the rules consistently and set your sanctions clearly. Okay? Insisting that a player stands beside and away their infringed opponent is a real clear indication of compliance by that player that's been penalised, and also you asserting your authority as the umpire. Okay, the minute you get loose on that, everything else laxes up as well. Okay, so setting strong penalties, using strong hand signals, a big voice. Okay, you would have noticed on the webinar, there's a whole load of terminology for everything in the rulebook. So you don't even need to think, you just need to know what to say and when. If you do all of that well, then half of the time, there are no game management escalations. Now, within here, there are other things that you can try. So I've always said that your tone of your whistle, you can speak through this. You can let somebody know, contact goalkeeper, obstruction goalkeeper. Probably didn't come across, but that was a really big, loud whistle. That shows the player that infringement was different to everything else. Okay, so try and keep your whistle consistent for general infringements, but if you need a big one to gain that player's attention, with the greatest of respect in the world, I often think the whistle is an oi, oi, look over here. What? Obstruction goalkeeper. Okay, so use that. A double blow on the whistle could get a player's attention. No, in line with me. Thank you. Okay, if you're setting a sanction. Now, your voice, I've given you a couple of examples there. Your voice can communicate how severe or how normal a decision is. But what you can do is you can raise your voice and use a terminology reshuffle to gain a player's attention. Now, we would all talk, I've shown you on this presentation, contact goalkeeper, penalty pass, red. Okay, that is what you would do for most of the infringements, especially if you're being assessed. But once you're actually in the swing of things and you're free from the shackles of being a trainee umpire, you can become a little bit like an experienced driver with the cross over their hands and looking in this rear view mirror. And you can try out some of these techniques. Wing defense, what? Contact. Okay, so by saying the player's playing position first, it's a change. Now, it has been said for a long time, there are even studies on it, that after about 5 minutes, an umpire's voice and their whistle just disintegrates and disappears into the background. It turns into white noise. Now, it's all right to be in white noise if infringements are obvious, but where they're different or where they may be going towards danger, that's when you need to gain that player's attention and do something different to break that white noise. Okay. Now, it always makes me smile when umpires are quite timid. And I know people when they're learning are quite timid, but when umpires, they Contact goalkeeper. Are you sure? No, I'm not really. Okay. Contact goalkeeper. Are you sure? Yes, absolutely. So be confident, make eye contact, because eye contact is about connecting with that player. If you look in somebody's eyes and you say to them, we'll talk about this in proactive advice next time, in the next slide, wing defense, you need to stay out of the circle. Okay. If you then say, wing defense, don't go in the circle anymore, they're not going to know. So you make a connection with sustained eye contact. Okay. Now, the one thing that is most important in all of this, you do your job properly and well. Players, if you're watching this, you have the responsibility to change your behavior in line with the umpire's rulings. Coaches, if you're watching this, you need to support your players, as do you guys, teammates, if you're watching this as well. Okay? Because we're all in this together and the rules have been rewritten to keep you guys safe. Okay? So, moving on. I did allude to this earlier on, but here is a spoiler alert. Cautions have been removed from the rulebook. There are no cautions given anymore. Now, the reasons that cautions have been removed is because they were a bit like candy floss at the fairground. They were being given out and there was no escalation. They had no impact and people weren't changing their behavior. So what cautions have been replaced with is proactive advice. Okay? Now, proactive advice is used for low-level incidents that do not compromise player safety. So you wouldn't give proactive advice. Again, I use this example all the time. If a player was knocked in the air, caused to fall and bang their head, you wouldn't say, goal defense, please don't do that again. Okay. You have to act on that because it's dangerous. Now, proactive advice is a specific set of feedback that is given that advises a player of the specific behavior that you want changed. Specific, okay? You have to say what you want them to change. Now, you do not hold time for proactive advice, okay? But I'll give you a little tip at the end of this if you're not sure that the connection's been made, okay? But some of the examples on the screen, if a player keeps going offside into the goal circle, okay, you can penalise them for going offside. That's all part of effective umpiring. But if you've got to the point where you feel you need support and to make it more obvious and clear to that player, you can give them proactive advice. Wing defence, stop going into the goal circle. Okay? Now, with proactive advice, only one piece of proactive advice can be given to the same player by either umpire. Okay? So if I give a player proactive advice, they cannot get it from my co-umpire and they only get it once. If that player then does anything else, you're looking at other parts of the game management ladder. Now, the reason that's important is because you've only got it once, so you've really got to try and use all of your effective umpiring techniques before you go on to proactive advice. Okay, that first step on the game management ladder. Now, again, the example on the screen here, for a player that's too close, consistently too close, goalkeeper, increase your defending distance. Okay. For a specific type of contact, goal defense, stop holding your opponent's arm. Okay. So contact goal defense, stop holding your opponent's arm. Okay. Again, specific behavior, specific information that of the behavior that you want changing. And again, it's one of these things. It's not a huge big deal, but it gets annoying. A player that keeps on going offside at a centre pass, wing attack, wait for the whistle at a centre pass. Okay, it is a clear line in the sand. Now, as it says on there, proactive advice is deemed to be binding on your co-umpire. And that is why it's so important that when you give it with a clear and loud voice so that everybody in that arena, be it with 10,000 spectators at the copper box or 15 people and their dog down the local courts. Everyone there needs to know that what that player's done is not acceptable and you've just told them to change it. Because if they keep doing it or something else a bit dodgy, then it's going to be escalated. Okay. Now, because it's binding, it is always good umpires to check with each other at quarter time. Okay. Or an interval. So just come over. Any proactive advice? No, I haven't. I haven't done anything. What about you? Yeah, I actually have. The goalkeeper did quite a few obstructions. It wasn't repeated, but I did tell her to increase her defending distance. Okay. So then when the player switches up the other end, effectively, because this is binding, that umpire, if that player continues to be too close and obstruct, then the umpire knows proactive advice has been given. Therefore, their next step is up the game management ladder. Okay. Now, what happens if players don't respond to proactive advice? Well, in the 2020 rules of netball, the advancement of a sanction, so moving a sanction forward up to half a third, was limited to instances of delaying play and a few technicalities within failure to take the court. Now, that part's been tidied up by Rule 3, but now a sanction may be advanced up to half a third if the umpire is using that as part of a game management strategy. And it's not just delaying play, it can be anything. It could be a contact, it could be a repeated obstruction, it could be intimidation. Okay, there are lots of other things, and we'll talk about the actual things a bit later. But an umpire may now advance for serious infringements up to half a third. Okay. Now, one of the things that umpires often forget is that the infringing player has to come with the sanction as it's advanced. Now, if that's into an offside area, they can't obviously go offside. They come to the edge of that offside area and they are out of play. They don't speak, they don't gesticulate, anything like that, but they come up with that player. Okay. Now, another part of this rule, it does say advance or escalate a sanction. Now, escalating a sanction, as we know, we have minor and major infringements. You know, minor infringements for things like footwork, nearly said obstruction, playing the ball, breaking and offside. Okay. Now, with offside in particular, if you are finding that a player is going offside a lot, and also you'd given them proactive advice, you may use step 2, you might flip the free pass that you would give for offside into a penalty pass. Okay. Now, the fact that you've escalated that from a free into a penalty pass shows an increase in the degree of seriousness of that. Now, one thing I will say towards the top and the elite games, so both internationally and in Super League, we haven't really used that rule very often. Okay, the game goes so fast at that point that we don't have that much time to think. So we haven't used it. Now, I'm also not sure that it's probably going to be used very much in the grassroots game, but we never say never. It is always something, particularly for breaking an offside, that you can use. You know, actually, you've done a couple of those. I've given you proactive advice. Now we're going to flip this to a penalty pass. You're out of play now, wing attack. It's going to be a penalty pass. And that, again, is a clear indication to that player that that's the line drawn on that type of infringement. Okay. Now, again, as we said before with proactive advice, advancing or escalating a sanction would not normally be appropriate. Well, it's not normal. It's not appropriate at all for infringements that endanger player safety. If it's dangerous, you won't be escalating. You are straight suspending or you are straight ordering off. Okay. So danger equals suspension or order off. Okay. Now we're just going to look at some scenarios of advance just so it gets in your mind of where it goes. So we've got one at the top. If you have a situation, and let's say, for instance, I don't know, an intentional obstruction in this position here. Okay, so an intentional obstruction here, you advance up to half a third. The ball is moving from your area of control into your co-umpire's area of control. Now, you as the controlling umpire will move the ball, the taker, the infringed player, and the infringer. You will move them to the new position. The minute that they are in position, the other umpire takes over. So the person with the ball, if they infringe the 3-second rule or the held ball, or if they footwork, or if a player contacts or obstructs that taker, it is your co-umpire that deals with that. Okay. Now, again, one thing to just remind you, if the ball is in and close to the transverse line in centre third, regardless of how much you would love to get it into the goal circle, especially if it's an intentional obstruction here and there's a shooter underneath the post, you can only advance up to half a third, and that is to outside the circle. If the ball is inside the goal third, it can be advanced into the goal circle. Okay. And likewise, if it's at the edge of the goal circle, it can be advanced under the post. All right. Now, one of the questions that we get asked a lot is, okay, we've got a goalkeeper who is repeatedly obstructing, and you decide that you want to advance them, but they're already stood under the goalpost. So advancing them is not going to work. What do you do? Now, what you would do is you would say to that goal defense, that obstruction goal defense, consider this an advance. You need to increase your defending distance. Okay. So consider this an advance tells them that that's that line on the game management ladder that's gone. Okay. So you do communicate that. Now, in all of these situations with advancing, there is no requirement to hold time. So you shouldn't ordinarily hold time. But in the time rule, okay, there is a kind of caveat in there that an umpire may hold time to avoid the material loss of playing time, okay, or the incidental loss of playing time. Now, the example I'll give you is if a player, let's say, for instance, there's 4 seconds to go in a quarter, and a player throws the ball away, and the ball's gone, okay. If you don't hold time at that time, there will be incidental playing time lost because it will be a goal scoring opportunity missed. Okay, so it probably would be pertinent to hold time at that time, get the ball back, position the sanction, penalise the delaying player. If there is an advance, put it in the new position, stand the player out, and then basically take a big breath, everyone ready to go, blow the whistle to time on, and the goal will likely be scored. Okay, so as I said, if you're advancing a sanction, you ordinarily don't hold time unless there is the chance of incidental loss of playing time. Okay, so if you don't hold time and a goal's not going to be scored, that's exactly when you do hold time. Okay, so that's advancing and escalating a sanction. Now, the actual bones of the game management rules have been really, really well defined. So they've been defined into unfair play, unsporting behaviour, and dangerous play. And these can be found on page 64 to 66 of the rule book. Okay, so we're going to look at each of these. Now, within unfair play, we've got delaying play, intentional infringing, repeated infringing, a disputed ruling, and intimidation. Okay, now all of these carry a penalty pass. That's the first thing. And it is then advanced. Now, there's an asterisk there. Okay, if it's the first time. Okay, so it's a penalty pass which is advanced if they've done it the first time. If, for instance, you advance or whatever for repeated infringing and then they do it again, you are at the next level of the game management ladder, and that may well be a warning in that aspect. Okay, so the first time it happens, it's a penalty pass which is advanced. So let's just look at these ones very quickly in particular. So delaying play we've already talked about. Basically, delaying play is time wasting. Okay. Now, intentional infringing is an infringement where a player has done everything they possibly can not to avoid infringing. Okay. So it may well be that they've just stood, there's seconds to go and they've stood in front of a player and they've intentionally infringed. Intentional contact, as I've already said, is a bit of a dodgy one, but it is still in there, okay? Because I always like an intentional contact as a punch and a push. But a player that is running, they go for a fly and they have that option to come out. They go, oh God, I've made my timing wrong. They hit a player. They might hold on to them and not cause danger or limit the impact. That may well be an intentional contact, but it may well be more appropriate to give a warning. It certainly wouldn't be, if they've tried to limit the impact, a suspension in that aspect. Okay, so we have found now the most frequent intentional infringement is intentional obstruction around the circle edge. Okay, technically that's delaying play, especially if there's a pass on, but that's one of the most common ones. Now, repeated infringing, you're all going to be sitting there thinking, but how many? Okay. Now, I can't tell you a number, but what I can say is in repeated infringement is definitely more than once. Okay. Now, if you remember what I said earlier on, whenever you're giving instructions and you're penalizing the player, this is about you making a connection with that player. Contact goalkeeper, add a bit of proactive advice. Goalkeeper, you need to reduce the number of contact infringements. Okay. Now, one of the things I did forget to mention is if a player is not sure that they've been given on proactive advice at the time and they look at you a bit strangely, you can say, and consider that proactive advice. Now, what we want you to try and do is deliver this all at the same time so that they're left in no doubt. But if you do look at a player and they look at you and say, I'm not sure, and consider that your proactive advice, that will leave them without any doubt. Now, repeated infringement, as I said, it's about making a connection. Okay. Now, if a player has been told you're penalizing them, and I think the trigger or the instinct for an umpire in here is when you feel like you're umpiring that player more than they are playing, that is probably when you're getting towards repeated infringing. If you follow the earlier steps of game management, if you penalize for repeated, it should be a surprise to nobody. Often you'll see players going, yeah, absolutely, fair play. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. But repeated infringing is definitely more than once. But what you've got to do is you've got to try your best to change that player's behavior. And when it does come, it shouldn't be a surprise. Now, the only other thing to add about repeated infringing is it doesn't need to be just one rule. A defensive turnover, the goal shooter might obstruct the pass advantage. They might contact then as a contact. Then they might do something else. And it could all happen in a very short space of time. That could also be ruled as repeated infringement. It doesn't have to be the same infringement. It can be a combination. Now, a disputed ruling used to be dissent with an umpire. Okay, so disputed ruling only occurs from a player challenging an umpire's decision. Now, what we would always say is umpires have a thick skin. Okay, sometimes players might protest, but they may well not be doing it to you. A player that slams the ball down in frustration and the ball pogos on the spot, are they doing it with your decision, or is it frustration with themselves? A player that says, oh, for goodness sake, is that directed at you? Are you absorbing that and taking that too personally? Okay. Keep your thick skin. If they say, oh, for goodness sake, umpire, open your eyes, that's a disputed ruling. Okay. So you've got to be careful that you don't personalize stuff and assume that it's directed at you. Okay. Now, the last part in unfair play is intimidation. Now, this isn't a new thing in this rule book, but there has been a bit added. But I will just say what I always say on these game management workshop. Intimidation is only that if you, as the umpire, say that. Okay. Now, if you go the first time, the first obstruction or the first kind of defending in a game, and a player is marking beautifully over the ball, and they come down over the eyes and then drop down, is that likely to be designed to distract? Because that's what intimidation has to be. It has to be an action that's designed to distract. Or was it just a player overbalancing? A player that is counting 1, 2, 3. Are they counting to make the shooter shoot quicker and to try and put the shooter off? Or are they teeing up their defender to jump on the 3rd second? Okay. Now, in all of those examples, you have to give the players enough time to adapt. So you can't just go sailing in with that straight away because you give yourself nowhere to go. Okay. But what you can do is not even proactive advice. Okay. Counting. Oh, yeah. Okay, umpire. Short statements can still be given. Just because proactive advice is there does not mean to say the quiet word is dead. Okay. Now, the quiet word is more quiet than it's ever been. It may well be only a couple of corrective words. Goal defense, stand beside. That's a quiet word. Okay. Wing defense, stay out of the goal circle. That is more precise. It is telling the player their behavior needs to change. Therefore, it is proactive advice. Okay. So that's one of the questions that we are asked. But with intimidation, okay, only you decide what it is. It either is or it isn't, but make sure you've gone through some of those effective umpiring techniques. Some of them will be obvious, okay? Some of them will be obvious. A goal shooter that catches the ball and does that in the player's face, that will be intimidation. And often goal shooters are trying to do that to get the player to react to defend within point 0.9, and then unfortunately the defender gets penalised for obstruction. Very annoying if you're a defender. Now, the last thing that's been added to intimidation is something called sledging. Now, I'm not going to go through a whole long list of what sledging actually is, but if you watch the cricket, it's basically when Ian Botham used to chaunter in the ear of somebody and say, your mum's this and all kinds of stuff. Okay, that's not really what this game is all about. So you need to be aware of that sort of stuff. It doesn't happen very often, but it's been put in the rule book more because, as you know, the rules are applied at international level. Okay. Now, all of those instances, again, the first time they happen, carry a penalty pass, which is advanced. Subsequent repeats of that behaviour in unfair play or any other foul play, it's very likely that the game management rules will be escalated accordingly. Okay. Now, moving on. Unsporting behaviour. Okay, so within unsporting behaviour, we've got them grouped into these three areas: retaliation, abusive behaviour, and actions contrary to good sporting behaviour. Now, all of these instances carry a penalty pass where the infringement occurs, and in these ones, in unsporting behaviour, the player, as a starting point, is either warned or suspended. If it's really serious, okay, and we'll talk about that in retaliation, the player will be ordered off. Okay. Now, retaliation often occurs after a player has infringed somebody else, and then that player retaliates back to that. So I might contact somebody. Okay, it might be contacting the goal shooter, and we'll use that ball analogy. She may then push the ball into me, and I go stumbling back. Okay. Now, if I go stumbling back and get my footing, it's very likely been pushed, so contact and then pushed out the way, is very likely to be a warning. If I get pushed, hit, I stumble back, I fall over and bash my head on the post, it's very likely to be contact with the head or neck and an order off. Okay, because I've hit my head because she pushed me. Okay, so there are a couple of things in that part of the retaliation rule. Okay, now abusive behavior, again, it's basically with disputed call with an umpire. This is kind of the old dissent with an opposition player. So anyone using foul or abusive language, just conducting themselves and using gestures or whatever to the opposing team, will be covered by abusive behavior. Okay. Now, actions contrary to good sporting behavior, luckily, doesn't happen very often in netball. I had a beautiful mentor right when I started umpiring. She was a grand dame of England netball, unfortunately no longer with us, but she always used to say to me that, Gary, netball is a game for ladies played by ladies. So we don't need to worry about this part of the rule. But actions contrary to good sporting behaviour is a big clump of what if, basically. Now, the best example of actions contrary to sporting behaviour is something that happened in rugby. So you may well have learned about this a few years ago, that there was a player that bit into a blood capsule and then got this blood came from everywhere. And there's something to do with different substitution rules and blood stoppages and all that in rugby. And that actually got found out. That's a really good example of unsporting behaviour. One of the, I think it doesn't happen for a few years, but there was a situation about 5 years ago where a sweaty player basically did this really, really silly drop to the floor and scoot along and then got up and said, oh, can we hold time? The court's wet. So, we've also had back in the old blood rules, someone scratch a scab and wipe it on somebody's dress and say they've got blood on them. They have to go off now. Luckily, the blood rules have all been tidied up. But anything, again, if you want to email me and if you can think of any other examples for actions contrary to good sporting behaviour, gary.burgess@englandnetball.co.uk, I would love to hear from you. But basically, that's a whole umbrella of all of those things, what if scenarios that aren't really, really serious, but they really aren't a good look for our game. Okay. Now, the last part of this here is dangerous play. Now, I have given you a load of examples of dangerous play, both in contact, causing a player in the air to fall. Now, this is all about protecting player safety. Now, anything to do with the head and neck, either hitting the post or hitting the floor, okay, that is basically a quick box tick in dangerous play. But I must caveat that. And again, remind you of what I said earlier. We are an aerial game. Okay, we are an aerial game. So you may well have a slight brush or a slight bump. When we go back to interference, you must have an infringement for this rule to be triggered. Okay, if it's contact, there must be a contact infringement to start with. Okay, so don't just assume, you have to basically see it. Now, I know that people will be nervous about dangerous play because effectively the same behavior that might have happened last year would have got a warning. It's now elevated to be a suspension. Now, that's not on you. That's not a problem for you because you are just applying the rules. And players, you are thinking about the rules. Okay. So if you are going into an intercept and you think, actually, I'm going to go and get this, but I'm going to hit her. I'm going to bump into her. And actually, she's lined up with the post and she's probably going to hit the post. That's when you think, actually, this is probably not a challenge that I'm going to go for. Okay. There is no provision, as I said earlier on, in the rules book time before last, the 2016 rule book, there was accidental dangerous play. So a player that tripped over somebody's foot, that was there. It might have been an accident. A player that deliberately tripped would have been suspended. That's not there. Regardless of whether or not it's accidental or deliberate, the same behavior has to happen. Okay. So it may well be some of the suspensions that we've had in Super League, beautiful players, they wouldn't dream about doing anything dangerous, but they've just got their timing wrong. And unfortunately, it's caused that player to clatter and fall on the floor. Across the world in other leagues, we have also seen players moving at speed and just not stopping. They had an opportunity, but they just thought, gosh, there you go. Those are the situations where the intent is there and it is reckless and it's dangerous. And that's where the scales swing more to order off than they would do with suspension. Okay. Now, the only thing I would say again, and I'll repeat this in there, you still have the ability to warn on contact infringements. Okay. If they're not dangerous and you feel actually, I'm going to draw the line here, and that's where I'm going to say to you, let's just have a chat here. Let's just hold on. Have a think about your timing. You hit her there, but you stopped her from falling over. She's not hurt. She's not dangerous. But actually, I'm going to give you a warning because that was a heavy contact or that was a late contact. Okay. If it's dangerous, you're either suspending or you're ordering off. Okay. Now, when considering whether or not it should be a suspension or order off, the things that are on the screen, you need to think about. So if it's intentional, or sorry, was it intentional, reckless, or avoidable? Okay. If it was and they could and they didn't, you're more over to order off. If it was not avoidable because of just, someone might, let's say, for instance, another example of a warning this could be a player's only got eyes to the ball and they're backing up, and they go to jump and they hit the person behind them and the person falls over. Don't bang their head on the floor, but they fall over. It would be very easy to suspend the person that was in front, but they didn't know that player was there. They had eyes for the ball. So they didn't know, therefore, in that example, a warning, again, may be more applicable in that sense. But actually, if they sight the player, they think, I can get that. They go to get it, they don't get it, and they take the player's head off, then again, you're probably going towards order off. Did it have high or low impact? Again, did the player realize at the last minute and put the brakes on and not hit them as hard? Or did they just think, no, I'm going through? Okay. Was the action low or high speeds? Same again, in the air or on the ground. On the ground is a lot safer. There's a lot less chance of danger on the ground than there is in the air for a player in the air. Was it high or low force? Was it hard or soft? Okay. Or did it happen while stationary or moving? The game is so fast now. Players are moving all in the right direction or all in the same direction. And there is not 100% awareness all the time. Okay. So whenever you're dealing with dangerous play, think about intent. Did the player really mean to do that? Were they just playing netball and it went wrong? Okay. Or did they intend to do what they've just done? That's the $1 million question. Now, again, I am a strong believer in dangerous play probably umpires itself. in a lot of the scenarios that you will see in netball, it'll umpire itself. And I don't think dangerous play will be a surprise to people. The thing that I think people will find hard is having to umpire through the game management ladder. So repeated, what happens after that? What happens after that? When you have to actually physically umpire it and think about it, I actually think that's tougher than when, again, a player in the air is knocked and caused to fall. Your instinct will say something needs to happen. There's something is either a suspension or an order off. Okay. Now, this is available to download from the comments in this video and also on the rules and updates page. But this is just a foul play checklist. It's got unfair play, sporting behaviour and unsporting behaviour and dangerous play. And it just shows you all of the starting points for these penalty passes and advances. Okay. So you can download that or you can take a screenshot of that in your own time. Now, other game management updates that we can't forget. Okay, now, just as a reminder, a player can only receive one warning and one suspension. Now, you would have heard umpires last year, if you do this, any further foul play, etc., etc. You only have to inform a player now what happens next if they are warned. Okay, so hold time, wing defense, that's repeated obstruction, and that's a warning. Any further instances of foul play, and you will be suspended. Okay, so you only have to inform that player what's happening next if they basically go through to the next sanction, so on a warning. Okay, now a player must be suspended if they engage in dangerous or highly reckless play that endangers player safety or that is sufficiently serious to warrant an immediate order off. Sorry, there's a bit of a mouthful there, but basically that bullet point's there to say if that happens, you've got to do it, and if you don't, there's a problem basically. Okay, now because the game management rules have been uplifted, okay, there is a chance that more people will be suspended. And if a player returns to court after a suspension, they could also then be ordered off because it's a bit like football. This is the only time I'll say netball's like football. But basically, if you think of a suspension as being a yellow card, okay, because you can come back on, any foul play, even if it's a lesser offence, will trigger an order off for that suspended player. Okay, so a player that's been suspended who returns to court runs the gambit of being ordered off if anything goes wrong. So they may be on the side on the circle edge, and the moment of madness, they may intentionally obstruct instinctually, and it's like, oh no, I've got nowhere to go. Hold time. You've already been suspended, and that's intentional obstruction. As a result, I'm ordering you off. Please report to the umpire's chair. You should take no further part. Okay. Now, because those game management rules have been elevated, the order off period is now 4 minutes. And after that time, the player, the vacant position on court can be replaced. The player that's ordered off takes no further part, but that playing position can be replaced after a period of 4 minutes. Okay, now there has been one other update in game management, and that's to do with team officials and bench players that may well do naughty stuff. And that states in the event that a team official and or bench player does not respond to a warning, okay, the umpire can ask for them to be removed from the playing enclosure. Now, if you're in a stadium, that's ordinarily to the stand. If you're in a normal grassroots setting, it might be outside of the sports hall or outside of the fence or something like that. Okay, so those rules have been updated in that way. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this session. This is just a reminder. So we do get rules questions in all of the time, and the submission link can be found on the rules and updates page or all over our social media. If you pop a question in, we will provide you with a response. And there are, I think, about 70 questions in there already. Okay. We will also do this for the whole of this season. Okay, so if you've got a question, just check in there first of all. Okay, because it might already be answered. All right. I hope you've enjoyed this session, and I hope it's added more to the webinar that we've got. Now, whether or not you're a player, a coach, an umpire, an administrator, a parent, and you've watched this just to gain a better idea, ask questions, read the rule book, and listen to your umpires. They are not there to get at you. They are there to provide a platform for you to be brilliant. Okay? They give you clear instructions, they give you clear parameters to operate in. Where you go outside of them, they'll help you back in those parameters. If you choose not to go in, that is on you, not the umpire. Okay. The number one objective of the rules is players shall play within the rules and respond to umpires' calls. Okay, have a great rest of the summer, and I'm wishing everybody the best of luck for the return and the start of the 2024 rules on the 1st of September.